So, I mean, I think, at least in the brand entertainment world, a lot of people know you for Artificial and films with Patagonia. But I'm going to make an assumption that your filmmaking journey started before those projects. How did you get into film?
Funny, I'm dyslexic, and I was an ADHD kid, and I found experiences more fulfilling than books, and that nudged me to playing with imagery and telling stories. But the way I really got into it was through skiing and kayaking. So I was a professional skier for a short bit, which at that time meant you skied a lot and got paid a little. It's very different today. The athletes today are amazing. But I realized that in the group of people that I was competing with, that there were really kind of a cool story of people that were looking at a sport differently. And nobody had told the story the way that I thought it could be told. And I pitched a story to Powder Magazine, wrote a whole story, interviewed a bunch of people, and the editor of Powder Magazine called me and said, "We really like your story, but we're not going to publish it because that's not how it works." I was like, "What do you mean that's not how it works?" He's like, "We hire writers to go out and write things. You don't just get to send us a story." And I was like, "But you like the story." He's like, "Yeah, but that's not how it works." And I hung up the phone with him, and I'm like, "I'm going to make a film." And all I'd been doing was messing around with a video camera with a lot of whitewater, some skiing, and at the time I bought a 16mm camera on eBay, and I think eBay was like 2 years old, so I was sure I was going to get scammed. And then my friend Adam Delorier, who was he and his brothers had been making ski films for quite some time, showed me how to load it, and literally said, "This film goes here, it goes through here, it goes back here, close this up, and then this is focus, and if it's sunny, turn this dial to like 22, and if it's cloudy, turn it to like 8. I didn't even really know what aperture was. It's terrible to say. I mean, I was a photographer, I messed around, but I'd never like studied it. And then I just went out and started capturing images of the people I skied with, turned that into a film, and showed a little bit of it to brands in Salt Lake City, actually, at the outdoor retailer event. And we garnered enough money to make a film. And all of a sudden, I was a filmmaker, and I hadn't really planned on being a filmmaker, even though Jaques Cousteau was my childhood idol, and I went into science because I thought of Cousteau as a scientist, and so I studied fish and underwater science, and of course later on realized Cousteau is first and foremost a filmmaker, and we know his story because of that. So for 6 years all I did was make action sports films, and then I realized that it kind of felt like the same story being told over and over, and it wasn't about the film, it was about the footy, like if you got the shot and how good the shot was. And I was like, I want to have an opportunity to tell a story that has a bigger arc. And so I did what every aspiring filmmaker does at that point, which is do anything you can make a living doing. And so I went into reality TV, which was terrible, but it taught me a couple things. Then I started making some documentary films that were more than just ski films. And then I landed on a film about a book, which was one of my favorite books as a kid, and I didn't read a whole bunch, which is called The River Why. David James Duncan, classic story, a coming of age story about a kid who grows up fly fishing. And it was like my closest step to telling a story about environment, connection to environment. And I realized, hey, this is the way you do this. And so I wanted to kind of push farther the medium, and then a group of friends, we started making a bunch of little films and ended up making a thriller horror film that won the Sundance Film, or not Sundance, the Tribeca Film Festival. The first thriller horror that ever won Best Narrative. I was a producer of that, but it came out of this group trying to just do things differently. Right. And then I was like, okay, now this is great, but I was like, thriller horror that's not my calling. Yeah. And it was through Yvon Chouinard of Patagonia, who I re-met many years later after I worked with him on a ski movie, and he asked me to make Artificial. And all of a sudden, I realized my life had come full circle, because I actually was like, hey, this is the closest I'll ever be to Cousteau, right? But that I had the chance to work with an environmental hero of mine and to make something meaningful. And I'm so happy because it nudged me where I wanted to go. But it's hard to get nudged because I think we're all a product of our opportunities. And if you get opportunities in one thing, you stay in it because we have to, that's how you build professions. But when you can nudge yourself into something else and start to find ways to put it together, then it becomes like really fulfilling, because you're like, hey, this thing that I always wanted to do, but I didn't know how to really do it, starts to come into focus. And so then I made a film with Jeremy Jones, who's one of the top snowboarders in the world, turned climate activist, about why we're so divided politically around issues of environment and climate, quite honestly. And that was, again, really interesting to me because it was nuanced. And I began to realize that these environmental films don't have to be preachy. They can be nuanced. And they can leave the audience asking more questions than they did when they saw, before they'd seen the film. And that's a good thing. Like if we tie it up with a bow and you stop thinking about it, then we just gave you an hour, hour and a half of entertainment. But if you go the next week and go, what do I do with that? Then we got you. And that's the kind of filmmaking I like to do now, which are, they stick with you. They kind of make you have to kind of do some work to see where you fall within the issue. And that's what I've loved to do and hope to keep doing more of.
When you get that call from Yvon Chouinard for Artificial, what goes through your mind at that point? Because it's, you know,
it's funny.
I mean, one, it's a complicated subject.
Yeah.
But it's also being produced by a brand, right? And that's early in the days of this brand storytelling world. Like, how are you thinking about that film and approaching it as a filmmaker being hired by a brand?
You know, it's a very interesting story, because the first moment I thought, I can't believe this is, I know he wants, this isn't real. This isn't going to really happen. And so we had to put together a little short film to pitch to them. Even though he'd said, would you make it? We had to show what we would make. So we made this little short film and then had to go in front of the entire 40-member or whatever it was, like, board of Patagonia to say, this is what we're going to do. And they got behind it. And afterwards, I remember Yvon saying, I'm stoked. And I was like, wow, this is happening. Like, this is really going to happen. And fun fact, at one point in the film, I thought the whole thing was going to come crashing down. I didn't think that we could make it. I didn't think that we had a film that was compelling enough. And it took a lot of, like, personal angst and creative, just hard work and grind from myself and the team that were on it. Colin Kreiner, who was my creative partner and editor, we just kept punching and punching and punching to find it. And then it worked. And when it started to work and we started to see that the film actually had some legs, then I was like, what does this mean to be brand supported? And for me at that time, Patagonia had made one other feature film. And I wondered if it was a liability at one level in taking it to film festivals, because they would say, oh, you know, snooty, oh, that's not independent film, oh, you brand funded. I thought, oh, what will this preclude it from being seen? And then I became very clearly swayed to recognize that the film that we made, which was about the end of wild, as seen through what we've done to salmon and trout, is just a proxy, like how humans have to tinker with everything, and that we've lost respect for wild. I realized that that might not have gotten the appeal with the normal audience. And so having a brand like Patagonia that can reach out to a very active audience and say, watch this, we believe in it. And it happened right before my eyes. And I was like, whoa, they're not kidding. Like, audience reach of brand, because they've had to elbow their way through competition and messaging with all the other brands that do something similar, is real. And using that as a tool to reach specific motivated viewers, I realized it was the only way the film could have really succeeded the way it did. And then I started to say, wow, you know, brand has power of audience and activation if they so choose. But they're very, very quixotic, I would say, because unlike Patagonia, which is privately held, they have shareholders, they have boards, there's different mechanisms for making those decisions, which I think makes them hesitant about making really provocative work. And I think that's what we need more of. We need more better stories. But I think brands hold back on, like, We might upset somebody. We might turn off a consumer group or set, class of people. And I think that that's where it gets a little bit tricky. So then you start to realize that's the double edge of the sword. They have audience, but they also have deep restrictions. And so how do you navigate that? You know? And I think that's the question. Every brand has to approach when they look at film as something more than just long form advertising, which it shouldn't be, and say, how do we do this with pure intent, recognizing there's a little risk, you know? And we are risk averse, especially in a very highly politically charged environment. People do not want to upset one whole ideologic spectrum at the expense of invigorating the other necessarily. So it's a delicate time, I think, for brand funded film.
I want to go back to something you said earlier in talking about artificial, in that it wasn't working.
Yeah.
When it comes to storytelling, and when you're looking at that project, like, what wasn't working? What were the missing pieces that you had to find as you were putting it together to go, like, this is something people want to watch,
yeah,
that has conflict, that has a resolution? Like, what were you looking at in that and going, like, this thing's it's not hitting the mark where it needs to be if we actually want to drive change on the other side?
I think we fell into a trap that I think impact filmmakers have to be careful of, which is that we tried to solve the problem. And in doing so, we tried to find the voices that were solving the problem. But that's the trap. The filmmaker's job is not to solve the problem, it's to present the conundrum that hasn't been solved. And when we finally realized that all of the scientists giving all of the data, presenting the most coherent arguments, didn't do anything, because people don't respond to fact at some point. If fact and story collide and story is stronger, story wins every time. And so we leaned into the stories we could find that showed how ridiculous our meddling with nature was. Instead of telling it and showing information, we just said, watch this. Watch when a group of tankers takes a fish that were raised in troughs and drives them 3.5 hours to San Francisco Bay and dumps them in the bay. And the driver said, we just saved those fish 3.5 months. And you're like, but that's what they do. That's how they learn the river. That's how they know to come back. That's how natural selection takes. So we were like, oh, that's all we have to do then is show the arrogance of man, which was what Yvon really wanted in a film, but I didn't understand what he wanted, because how do you show the arrogance of man, right? Well, then all of a sudden we started to find all these ridiculous pieces where humans were just tweaking and thinking, we're better than nature. We've got engineering, we've got communication, nature, whatever, right? And so once we saw that, then the empathy came. That's when we unlocked it. Then we began to see the ridiculousness of mankind. And that's when we knew the drama was there. That's when we knew that we were revealing something new, and that the real kind of revelation at the end of the film would be respect nature for what it does and respect humankind for what it does, but they don't compete. They have to work synergetically. And so that's what we try to, synergetic, I don't even think that's a word, in synergy. And I think that was the journey. And when it wasn't happening, it was crushing, because I thought, we've been tasked by this group to tell this story and it's not working. What if it fails? Every filmmaker thinks, what if it fails, right? Every time. I mean, if we thought failure is the omnipresent, like, bad guy in the filmmaker's story. And you have to fight that antagonist back so that you can find the story. And I'm glad that they gave us the room to do it, because I think other organizations that are totally independent would, but I don't know if brands will, because brands kind of want to be there and know, are you hitting our messaging marks? And it's a different kind of reality.
What did you take from that experience, both from working with a brand and also from the challenges of making that impact story and sort of learning that lesson that you don't have to solve the problem. What do you take from that experience that you have brought forward with you in your subsequent films?
Well, always approach the film, in my opinion, especially impact film, by saying, what is the problem, and learn inside out and backwards what the problem is first, so that you can clearly articulate to yourself and the group of people that you're collaborating with, this is the problem. But now how do we get there in the most nuanced and circuitous way? If you just try to go right at the problem, you're probably going to bounce off of it and not have a very interesting story because it's too obvious. But if you allow character, which is what film is, specifically documentary film, to take you on their journey to solve that problem, you now take yourself out and you fall into their journey. That's our job. Our job is not to script this, otherwise that would be narrative film, which would be great, right? But that's not our job. In documentary film, we're supposed to allow character and action to reveal truth. And so when we try to fix the problem ourselves, we're imparting a truth that is not real. It's our truth, but we're not filming that. Although I will say, how many films have we seen where the filmmaker says, I'm making a film about an issue, and then they filmed themselves solving the issue, right? Supersize me. You know, there's an issue. I'm going to take it on myself. That's a really great style of film, but we wanted ours to be character-centric, that wasn't about us or the process of making the film. And I think that's what I bring forward, is that all of these have to still be engaging, like really entertaining, nuanced, character-driven films. And if you can find those characters, like Molly Kawahara in The Scale of Hope, another Patagonia film, who worked on the Obama climate team, who struggles with bipolar disorder, but thinks that she has a way to better message around climate action. I'm like, well, what? I mean, that's a whole bunch of stuff to unpack, but that's what makes film interesting. If the characters are unidirectional, it's kind of boring, right? So you just get on the wild ride of finding and then attaching to character story, and I think that can be brought through to all of these different types of films. When you're character-focused documentary film, if it has impact, what are they doing, right? Then you just keep asking, what are you doing? What are you doing? How do I see what you do? And they offer you into this world you could never script.
How do you, as a filmmaker, balance the line of objective documentary while working for a brand or a brand team?
Always a challenge, and it really comes down to the brand and the brand team's ethos, I would say, which is how much leeway are they going to give you? Even within Patagonia, there were things that they didn't want to discuss. They didn't want to engage in certain more provocative issues that might upset certain subsets of people. And we understood, you find the friction points, right? But the question is it like small friction points, or is it just like trying to walk over Velcro with fuzzy shoes, right? Is it like you can't even navigate because the friction is so much because they're trying to hold the story so tightly? And I think that you have to find that out, because many brands are used to the conceit of show us the storyboard, shoot the boards, right? We know what we're going to get because we see the boards, we approve the boards, you shoot them. Now give it your flavor and do your thing, but shoot the boards. And that's not what film is. That's not what documentary is. You start out, as one friend of mine told me, you start out stepping into a dark room with a flashlight and you don't know how you're going to get to the other side. But every time you take a step, you reveal something more until you find your way. But you find your way by relying on that process and the belief that it's going to be found the other side. But a brand that has quarterly reportings and various, leadership structures don't really like it when you step into the black room. They're like, black room, no good. That's not good. Show us the very well-lit room where we know everything is. And I think it comes down to every brand has a different structure and decision-making process, and how much do they let the filmmaker bring to it. And I don't think there's no rule book there. I wish there was, but there's no, you got to like go in there and figure it out.
I feel like in the documentary world, like the best adage is always like, if you know how it ends when you start filming, it's not really a documentary.
I like that. That's good.
From your perspective, you know, there's obviously challenges in working with brands in terms of, you know, meeting their values, you know, those quarterly metrics, like all of those challenges that come with that. But on the inverse side of it, like, what do you view as the opportunities as a filmmaker to be able to work with a brand to bring these stories to life?
Well, lately, so much of it is audience. And I say that because there has been a failure of the infrastructure of impact filmmaking. And that failure has been brought on by the way our media systems now work. We used to make a film, use equity. So somebody says, we're going to give you $100, and you say, okay, we're going to give you $100 plus whatever it makes. They could take a loss, but there might be a gain, right? And then you go to a festival, a sales-based festival like Sundance, and you try to sell the film. And if the film sells, somebody buys it, and they would buy it because they think they could sell it again in regions, right? And those regions then sold tickets, or they sold DVDs, or they sold a unit. Now, streamers, the Netflix of the world, have a different business model which sells subscriptions. That's very different. And so we who make impact film are measured in audience engagement against those that make the Beyonce documentary, right? Which sells itself because she's an amazing performer and everybody's interested in that. So we're now supposed to attract subscriptions the same way a Beyonce documentary would, right? Or Billie Eilish documentary. That's not the storytelling we do. And so we see time and time again, people coming to film festivals to watch these films, going to theaters when there's a theatrical showing to watch these films, going to local screenings to watch these films. But streamers don't want to invest that energy because they have to sell subscriptions. So that has changed our model very dramatically. Brand now has the opportunity, if they have the vision, to go around streamers. Because if brand can take a really compelling story and put it to YouTube and market the hell out of it so people go watch it on that platform, they can get more engagement than they could by having it land on a streamer and then sit there because nobody knows it's there, which happens quite often. So I think actually brand has this amazing studio-esque opportunity to create its own viewership and meet that viewership with engaging content. If they don't keep good content and it's not like engaging, so is the way, right? But I think that's the opportunity at hand now, is that the audience reach from brand and the ability to go beyond what a streamer wants to buy or commission is pretty amazing. But brands have to want to do it. And they have to recognize going into it that there's a strategy for making it, and there's a strategy for marketing it, and there's a strategy for distributing it so that people see it.
You've had a lot of success in telling these impact films for brands. And I know that spurred a nonprofit that you've started to help brands and nonprofits navigate this space. Can you talk about the genesis of that idea and what you see in this space that others are missing and how you're trying to bring them together?
Yeah, so we started Land and Sea for All, which is a nonprofit around helping organizations tell better stories for people and planet. So it's really focused on impact story within the environmental frame, if you want to say. There's certainly crossover because environmental and social have so many tendrils that impact one another, but that was our main focus. And when we realized that brands themselves have a hard time finding and telling good stories in this space, nonprofits have a hard time telling, not finding, because they know who's doing the work. Foundations are looking to support good stories. They oftentimes support nonprofits, but then they can't get the thing made or out there, which is where brand could come in. We saw this this nexus and said, wait a minute, why isn't this happening more? Because it certainly happens, but it's kind of just a little bit here and a little bit there. And we think now, because there needs to be better stories. We are almost 9 billion of us on planet Earth. And the way we view things today are very different than we did 10, 20 years ago. And sustainability and environmental concerns are things that, issues that people across the globe are asking questions about. And we have to, as storytellers, engage with that issue in a way that changes minds, right? And presents new ways forward. So why not help put these groups together? We can certainly do this individually with just one group like Patagonia, or individually like a group we're about to make a film for, another just nonprofit. But what about putting them together? And that's what we really want to do with Land and Sea for All, is help that, nurture it, but also help brands along the way to figure out how to tell stories in this space, how to find characters in this space, how to find thought partnership with nonprofits to find those stories so that they can be told well with a group of filmmakers. This isn't about me telling all these stories. This is about finding the stories and helping bring up other filmmakers to tell these stories. There's a number of friends I have in the commercial world. They're like, how do you get to tell these stories? I was like, well, I've had success in telling them, but once you're able to, it's kind of addictive because you realize how fulfilling it is. And they're like, I want to do that. And I was like, if we can help those people that really have been in the commercial world and want to step into impact filmmaking world, I would love this organization to help that as well. So it kind of invigorates new professional growth for creatives that want to tell different types of stories. But it's all focused on the story. How do we tell better stories of people and planet? Because once we see things through the lens that has been changed, we can never see them the same way. Think about what Blackfish did. If you see that movie and you want to go watch an orca in captivity, I would challenge you. Because once you've seen it, you're like, oh, I don't think I can do that ever again. But that changed our whole perception of an issue we thought like was kind of okay, and then it wasn't. And I think that's the kind of stuff that we want to do. And we just want to help foster that faster. We also want to take these kind of opportunities to help individuals and communities. And so we have this thing called Community Studio, where we're going to help individuals and communities that haven't had the opportunity to kind of engage with really quality storytellers and help them tell their stories, which they own completely. Because when we go into communities right now as a filmmaker, I walk away with their story, and whoever I'm commissioned to make the story for, they own it. And so recently I had something where I worked with a Native American group for, you know, a distributor. I won't name any names. They didn't use the segment in the piece. All of the time and effort that this group put forth to help tell their story, somebody else owns now. And it just makes me feel horrible. And so we want to find a way to help them own their own stories, but help them get there.
Last question before my not so rapid fire. From your perspective, what makes a great story?
What makes a great story? Well, always character first. And in the classic storytelling conceit, right? It's what does the protagonist want? What stands in their way of getting it? And then what makes a really great story is what do they do to get there? Right? Because if the story is, I want X, and I bump up against X and I give up, you know, there's something learned there, but the fight and the fortitude and the risk and the personal sacrifice, these are themes that are universal. And to me, when those are well developed and you see how people navigate the problem, that's what makes good story. I mean, we all would love to say, tie it up in a bow, it's a perfect winner every time, but it doesn't have to be that. If you're Boys State, well, I love the film Boys State. No spoilers, but the person that wins your heart may not be the person that wins the election. And that in that film, that's not a spoiler because it's been out for a long time, but meaning by that, like, they don't have to win the thing they're trying to win for us to attach emotionally to them and be carried on their story. It doesn't matter. If they come in 5th, you don't care because you're so invested in them. So I think a good story is that nexus between interesting character, big challenge, and then watching that nuanced way in which they kind of meet that challenge. And they may come apart at the seams. And that could be a good story too, as long as they're able to share that. If they come apart at the seams and aren't open with it, then we're left with kind of like, oh, but what do you show, right? But yeah, it's an interesting question because I'm constantly reminded that the good stories are the ones that have been told, but there's even better that haven't been told. And you never quite know, and that's what makes it so interesting. Like if we knew how it worked every single time, it wouldn't be as scary and fun.
Okay, before I let you go, I got 5 questions.
Yeah.
They're not as quick as I once thought, so just be prepared. What's a story that had an impact on your life and why?
Story that had an impact in my life. You know, there was a book that I didn't read much, as they say, because I'm dyslexic. And there was one book that I picked up that I couldn't put down. And it was called Adrift. And it's very much the same story that All Is Lost, film that Robert Redford was the star of, the no speaking in that, and very much the same story that Tom Hanks did when he was marooned. Remember the name of that film?
Castaway.
Castaway. And as a kid, it was about this true story about this guy that his boat hit something, he was solo sailing, and he went into a life raft and lived 283 days in a life raft by himself and survived. And I was so taken by this story. I couldn't put it down. My parents like, you read something. But it was because you could like viscerally connect at 12 or whatever I was with this guy that had to survive by his own wits against all odds. And it just hit me so deeply because we, in the book, unwound what he had to do mentally and physically. And I think now I look back on that story and I'm like, that is the perfect persona of good character, right? I was pulled into his story and I was like, oh, tell me more, tell me more, tell me more. It's a survivalist drama, right? But what did he have to do? That was like the perfect example of, what do you want? I want to live. What stands in your way of doing it? My boat sank. And what are you going to do to live? Well, I'm going to figure out every way possible to stay afloat until I get saved. And I look back at it now, and it's kind of, it hits all those points of story that I find interesting. But yeah, that was Adrift. Was an amazing process for me to find what books could be.
Amazing. What's one film you think everyone should watch?
Whoa. You know, it's hard to put favorite films out there, but one film I watched and said, I think this is my favorite film and I think everybody should watch is The Diving Bell and the Butterfly.
Oh, interesting.
Julian Schnabel film.
Mm-hmm.
And I think if I really unwind why, it might not be that far off from the book, which is, you know, it's about this man who's living the quintessential amazing life. He's the editor of Elle magazine, I believe, in Paris, and suffers this terrible kind of stroke-like episode where he's locked in and he has full cognitive abilities, but he can only use one eye. That's all he can move. And he finally finds a way to communicate with his nurse, and he types a memoir with his eye. And it's like a postcard from the other side. And when I saw that movie, I just thought it was so powerful in kind of exploring the human will, right? And that the human will is also nuanced and weird and funny, and that he can't move anything. He can only see out of one eye, and the nurse walks in and you hear in his head, which is voiced over in the film, ooh, look at her. She's pretty, like, he can't move anything. And he's still moved by like this desire for the nurse that walked in. And you're like, wow, humans are just so weird and it's so wonderful. But if you haven't seen that film, I say go watch it because it's kind of fantastical in its approach. And there's so many other ones, but that was one that I remember watching it going, I think that was one of my favorite films.
Very cool. What's something you never leave home without?
Oh, unfortunately these days, a phone charger. Yeah, I'd like to say a book, but I bring the books and I never read them. It's terrible. It's horrible. I actually never leave home without I'll use the word equipment, clothing, to be able to exist comfortably in a variety of climates. So even if I'm going to something that I need to dress up, wear a tux, etc., I have a raincoat and layers in case something I don't know why. I was just like, I know I haven't worked in the outdoors for so long and know how quickly things can change. I always just be ready.
Always prepared.
Always prepared to meet these different environments comfortably. And I think that's kind of, I don't know, you learn that when you spend a lot of time in the backcountry, right?
What's an important place to find inspiration?
Inspiration for me these days are found through talking to really engaged people. Because, I read a lot of news and politics. It's really hard to find inspiration in that. I do that because I like to understand the mechanisms of power and decision makers. But inspiration for me is having conversation and having people that challenge your way of thinking. I like to say that you can show up to a conversation and throw a real slow ball, and if you use a baseball metaphor, you throw the slow ball, the batter is going to be like, what is this, right? You throw the fast ball, and that batter wants to swing at it, right? And so if you can go into conversations prepared to throw the fast balls and engage, all of a sudden, amazing things bubble forth. And that to me is inspiration, because the things that other people know and see different from your own, that challenge your worldview in everyday little things, are the things that go, oh my God, I never thought about it that way. And then that is the thing that takes me down the wormhole of then researching, reading, learning more. But it mostly comes through oral communication and then kind of follow up, I think. It still comes down to this, one-on-one, let's throw fastballs and see what we come up with, and then find what new and weird thing we can think about.
I love it. It ties well into the last question. What's an important skill for all storytellers to develop?
Listen. That's the number one thing. You have to listen. Stop talking. Honestly, I'm talking now because you're asking me to talk, but the number one thing is listen. Shut your mouth and let other people talk. My mom often said when we were growing up, you have one breath in which you can talk about yourself, then every other breath is listening to other people. And I think that's a skill that people forget, because we always are trying to promote ourselves. That's how you kind of move through the industry of filmmaking and storytelling. But man, when you can listen to people, that's when the magic happens. Because you can't script what people say. And if you let them have the floor and you learn about them and the way they see the world, it opens up everything. But you gotta be curious, and you gotta listen.
I love it.
Yeah.
Thanks so much, man.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Of course.
Wet and everything from the waterfall.